But yeah, just by way of introduction, a little bit of introduction to Jnanavaca. Maybe he needs no introduction. Maybe you've been on Free Buddhist Audio before and seen probably one of the highest number of talks under his name. But yeah, I was just meeting up for coffee with Jnanavaca. Lovely just to go for coffee. Talking about the centre, talking about how I'm getting on in my life. But in a way, the best bit was hearing a bit from Jnanavaca's recent solitary retreat. It was kind of electric, actually. There we were, just in a cafe doing something quite ordinary over coffee, but it was electric. It was sort of unsettling and fascinating and enthralling. And I think what really came to mind is actually two very different aspects of Jnanavaca. He's got a sort of slightly mystical side. His meditation is very, very important to him. He's been on long retreats, a 6-month retreat a few years back. So there's a kind of something of a yogi in there with Jnanavaca. But then he's also been a chairman of the biggest Buddhist centre in the movement for about 8 years, 9 years. He's very, very involved with the College of Public Preceptors. So I was just really struck by this, actually, how fortunate we are to have Jnanavaca with us as president, because well, we do need to be organised at the Buddhist Centre. We need to kind of work out how to come together, don't we? But any way we sort of organise ourselves can kind of fall into habits. We can actually lose sight of why we're organising ourselves as a sort of institution. Very, very easy to do that. And it's not possible to avoid that simply by changing everything all the time. That's just another habit, a sort of restless habit. What instead you need is a direct sense of what a Buddhist centre is about, which really means a direct sense of what the Dharma is about. And that can only be discovered in personal experience. So Jnanavaca, I find frequently does that for me. He brings me back into contact with that living stream, that living spirit of the Dharma. So he's able to sort of include these two aspects in his life of kind of very involved with people, creating Sangha, but also stepping completely out of that into a radical renunciate life and going deeper into the Dharma. And actually, we all need that. We need those two in our lives. We need to be intensively engaged with other people in a world that's very, very easy to live a comfortable, isolated life. But we also need to sort of step away. We need that actually as a centre, as a Sangha, in order for what we do at the centre to be a liberative activity. Yeah, so that's what came to mind actually with Jnanavaca, and it was there over coffee in that moment, that slightly unsettling and fascinating moment of hearing a bit about the solitary retreat he's just come in. So yeah, just a bit by way of introduction to Jnanavaca. Very much looking forward to hearing what you're about to say.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Arthur City. Yeah, very lovely to be back here actually amongst you. Each time I come, I feel more and more like I'm just coming to another home in the Sangha, and it's a real pleasure. Really lovely to be here. So yeah, thanks for coming. It's interesting what you say, Arthur City. So I will be talking about these myths, as they're called, as Subhuti derived them, but just something about you saying, you're rejoicing in me. I think that Bhante has given us a complete world, a complete life. So this sort of renunciative or meditative life, and a fully engaged life where we're in relationship with each other. There are organizations, institutions, work, etc. I think that is part of Bante's vision that he's created for us, or he's given us at least a template that we can then engage in a complete life. That's kind of what I want to do with my life. I don't always throw myself in as completely as perhaps I'd have liked to, but it's not for want of opportunity. It's there. It's a privilege. So yes, I want to explore over these 3 nights 4 myths, or it's like 3.5 myths, or we'll decide. Maybe we'll decide between us whether it's 3 or 4. And it was inspired by a talk that Subhuti gave in 2003 that I was at. Maybe some of you were at. It was at an order convention. I was relatively newly ordained. I think I'd been in the order 4 years or so. And I was mesmerized by what he was saying. And for the next sort of, I don't know, nearly 20 years, I didn't hear very much about these myths. And then Maitreyabandhu and I kind of started talking about them more. And now, yes, we're in the process of writing a book. I say we're in the process, a bit of a cheeky thing, because actually he's doing the writing. I talked to him about it, and then he goes away and writes it. But I will have my name on the cover. It will be a kind of joint book. We'll have to scrap that from the recording if you're watching. Yeah, these myths, I guess, what Subhuti was trying to get at, and what I'm trying to talk about, you could say the Buddhist equivalent is drishti, or views. Views, we all have views all the time about everything, and we bring views to our Dharma lives. And views from a Buddhist perspective are not necessarily a good thing, they're not necessarily a bad thing, they can be both. They can be helpful and they can be unhelpful. This side of enlightenment, we will need to approach our experience. We will be approaching our experience through the lens of one or more views. It's said that the enlightened mind is free of views. And so that might be something that we can also talk about. And I say we because I hope that these 3 sessions will be a bit interactive. Let's see how we go. So views are one way of talking about this, but I think myth is a slightly more resonant word, because view, model, that's another word that we could use. They're quite, they have sort of connotations of being reasonable and rational. And I want to sort of suggest that some of what we're talking about is beyond or beneath the scope of reason. They're not always consciously held, these myths. By myth, I don't mean something that's false. I mean more mythic, something that's perhaps more true, but beyond just the reasonable world or reasonable sense. Yep, that's kind of what I mean. Buddhism, of course, you know this. I'm talking to people, many of you who have been in the Sangha longer than I, but we know that Buddhism is, well, it begins with the Buddha and an experience that the Buddha had of complete liberation from all dukkha, all mind-made suffering. It begins with that experience that transcends all ways of talking. We can talk about it, but the experience itself transcends all ways of talking. It's said to be atakavachara, which is beyond the sphere of reason. Actually, all experience transcends ways of talking. You know, I'm just having a sip of water here, and I can talk about it, but it transcends ways of talking. Experience itself is beyond that. The Buddha's experience seems to be even of a special of a higher order before that, beyond that, because it seems to transcend the very assumption of a self and a world, a real self in a real world. So Buddhism begins with this experience of the Buddha, but it also begins with us, or at least us who are not yet enlightened. Because Buddhism, you could say, is a communication between the enlightened mind and the unenlightened mind. If it was just the enlightened experience and nobody to communicate with, we wouldn't have Buddhism. The Buddha would just sit there, I guess. And actually, he when he first becomes enlightened, we're told that was his inclination to, well, if not just sit there, certainly not to teach. Whether that's fact or apocryphal, I think it says something about the fact that, well, one of the things it says is that the experience was complete in itself. But another thing I think it says is that it was very, very subtle, and the Buddha doubted whether he would be able to communicate it to the unenlightened mind. And then, of course, it said that he's urged by Brahma Sahampati, this mythic figure, that he will be able to teach, that there are some people in the world who will be able to understand what he's saying and communicate. He will be able to communicate his experience. And the Buddha himself has a vision. He has a vision of human beings, humanity as a bed of lotuses. Do you remember that vision? It's a vision that sees us all with equal potential for enlightenment in different stages of development, of growth, just like this bed of lotuses, with some lotus flowers, well, merely seeds actually, embedded in the mud, some emerging as plants, but still in the water, some with buds that are still fully immersed in this lake, some with buds that have started to open, some with flowers that are still submerged in the water, some that have cleared the surface of the water and are starting to open fully in the sun. And flowers of different colors, lotuses that were blue and white and red. He has this vision of human beings as plants, as lotus plants and lotus flowers in different stages of unfoldment. It's a profound image, because it's an image that's saying, look, we have equal potential. Each flower has the potential to open into the sun and fully open. It's an image that says growth towards enlightenment, of course, is somehow natural. Just as a plant, its natural urge is to grow, our urge towards enlightenment isn't something added on to us. It's not something, I don't know, just for Buddhists. That's what I'm trying to say. Yes, it's not added onto us, and it's not just arbitrary. It's innate in human consciousness, this urge to grow. You could say it's innate in all life, actually, that there is this urge to grow, and that growth, we've reached different stages of that. Different people will have not just grown differently, but at different stages. So this growth model is part of, you could say it's part of, the first myth that I want to talk about, which is the myth of self-development. The myth that the Buddha is outside of us, enlightenment is outside of us, that we are potential Buddhas, but that in order to reach enlightenment, we need to grow towards it. That's this first myth. It's the myth of growth, the myth of development, that we have potential to become Buddhas, and that journey to Buddhahood will be a path, and it'll be a path of growth. Yeah. That's that first myth. It's the classic Buddhist myth. It's the myth that the Buddha talked about time and time again in different terms. For example, when he talked about the threefold path or the Noble Eightfold Path, any path model is a model of growth. It's saying, look, you can tread this path and grow. Sila, Samadhi, Prajna, the threefold path, the classic path. When the Buddha was dying, when he knew that he was dying, the Parinibbana Sutta talks about him going from place to place. He knew that he didn't have long to live, and he didn't want to leave this earthly life, this body, before trying to revisit all the people, all the places that he'd taught, and see the Sangha one more time. And he is very, very moving. He goes from place to place, and again, we're told that he teaches Sila, Samadhi, Prajna, ethics, meditation, wisdom. He teaches the path in that most condensed and intensified way. Sila, Samadhi, Prajna. In a way, it's a very simple kind of model. This myth of development is shot through in the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon shot through with it. It's the model of growth. I was very struck when Bhante died. How many of you were at his funeral? Yeah, about a third of us were at his funeral. On his coffin was, and Bhante had, he will have directed how he wanted his coffin painted. It was a cardboard coffin. He wanted to be buried in a cardboard coffin at Adhisthana, which is what happened. He's still there under the burial mound. His body is anyway, or what's left of it. The coffin was painted with plants and flowers of all different colors and shapes and sizes, with rain falling down on them. And the rain is a symbol in that image of the Dharma. It comes from a parable in the White Lotus Sutra, in the Siddharma Pradipa Sutra, where the Dharma is likened to rain falling on a parched land, and all these plants grow from the same rain, and they grow in their own way. So it's very striking that that was the image that Bhante wanted on his coffin, that was painted on his coffin. I think it's very close to his heart. I think the Sangha that Bhante has created, us, the vision behind it is that the Dharma will rain down on us, and we will each grow in our own way, and yet we'll be linked, united in this community with a common vision. But we will become more individual. Bhante talked about the individual, the true individual. It's not a vision where we all grow in the same way and become more and more alike. It's a vision of individuality, nourished by the same rain of the Dharma. Beautiful image, and it's from the White Lotus Sutra. Anyway, that's the first myth, the myth of growth and development and path, and it's the classic Buddhist myth. But Subhuti talked about then another myth, which is also conceives of enlightenment as outside of us. But the myth here is one of surrender, of opening up to the influence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the influence of enlightenment. Enlightenment is conceived of being, as it were, ever present, like sunlight radiating down, and all we have to do is open up to it. It's a myth of devotion, of not so much of striving as of becoming receptive. And that's a surrender myth, and I want to come on to that tomorrow more. And then, well, Buddhism as it's developed, particularly later Buddhism, particularly Tantric Buddhism, but not just Tantric Buddhism. It's there in Zen Buddhism as well, and maybe other forms of Buddhism. Some forms of Buddhism talk about enlightenment as being within, the Buddha as not as some being outside of us, but enlightenment somehow being our deepest, truest nature. Somehow it has to be discovered within. And again, in the White Lotus Sutra, there are parables that point to this, and Bante's commented on them, that the myth of the return journey is a parable where somebody has just lost their way and forgotten who they really are, and they rediscover their true nature, their true identity, only after lots of effort and adventure. But really, they were always the true heir to the rich person, the rich man. They were their true nature was always enlightened. Or the jewel in the garment is a parable where somebody has this jewel sewn into a cloak, into their garment, and they wander around, and it's a jewel that's priceless, and they wander around thinking that they're a poor man and have all sorts of endure all sorts of hardship, when actually a friend of theirs has sewn in this priceless jewel, and they only discover that after many years of striving. That sort of parable is saying, look, we're already in possession of this priceless gift of enlightenment, that is our true nature, and we've forgotten it, or we've covered it over with delusions, and we're wandering around in samsara lifetime after lifetime, as it were, needlessly, because our true nature is enlightenment, is Buddhahood. So the myth there would be one of discovery, of self-discovery, of discovering who we really are. And that's the third myth. The fourth myth, in case I don't get to it, I might as well say what it is, is that yes, enlightenment is within. Buddhahood, as it were, is within our mind. It's the deepest level of our mind. But rather than have to discover it, have to dig for it, having to, like in the myth of the return journey, the young man has to shovel this huge mound of earth or dirt for 7 years for no particular reason, but anyway, that we're given. But rather than dig for the truth, you allow it to emerge, you relax into your true nature. It emerges. If we let go of holding on so tightly to the story of me, then something very, very beautiful will emerge, trusting in that. So emergence is the fourth myth. So you've got these four myths. Two of them envisage enlightenment, Buddhahood, the goal as outside of us, and two of them envisage it as within. Two of them view the path as one of effort, development and discovery. We have to do something. We have to use our will, our effort, and either grow towards or discover the goal. And two of the myths are more about receptivity. Surrender is about opening up to the goal, to Buddhahood from without, and emergence is allowing the goal, Buddhahood, to emerge from within. Does that make sense? So you've got these kind of, this symmetrical, if I could draw, it's a grid or whatever, activity, receptivity, the goal being outside or within. Now, the truth, of course, is that none of those are true. None of that's true, because Buddhahood, enlightenment, it transcends ideas like outside and inside, within and without. If you were realized now, you would see that actually this notion of inside me or outside of me is part of the delusion of the unenlightened mind. We create this sense of inside and outside. So that's gone. And then if self has gone, this notion of self, who is it that is making the effort anyway? Or who is it that's relaxing? This whole notion of inside, outside, will or receptivity, all of that breaks down. All we've got is models, because the experience itself transcends all ways of talking, all ways of conceiving, all ways of knowing. But these models or myths are, well, essential. They're necessary to guide us along the way. We do need some sort of working models. The thing with these myths or models, let's call them myths, I like that word. The thing with these myths is that they all have a front and a back. That's how Subhuti talks about them. They all have positive qualities, advantages, you could say, if approached in the right way. And they all have their back side, which is all the disadvantages if you grasp this myth in the wrong way, all the pitfalls. It's a bit like if you've got a landscape of mountains, a range of mountains, you will also have valleys. You cannot have mountains without valleys. You can't have a mountain range without valleys. These myths will have a front and a back. And what Maitreyabandhu and I are exploring, what Subhuti began exploring, is the front and the back of each of these myths, because what he's saying, I think crucially, is that the more awareness that we can bring to the front and back of each myth, the more likely we are to not fall down the pitfalls, not get stuck in an unhelpful way in the back of one of the myths. The other reason why it's helpful is that I think different people with different temperaments may respond to different myths. But also, each of us may respond to different myths at different times in our life. As our Dharma life unfolds, it's very likely that you will respond to different myths at different times. Certainly that's been the case with me. And then thirdly, I respond to different myths in different situations in my life. So for example, I don't know what to say. Oh yeah, when I was chair of the LBC, much of the time I was doing things that I wasn't really inclined to do. Yeah, I was I don't know, managing people, chairing meetings, looking at finances, worrying about whether we could build Vajrasana or not. Trying to manage that project was effort. It went against the grain of my temperament, and I knew that it was a good thing to do. Yeah, and I want to serve the Dharma, and I want to serve our Sangha, and I want to try and spread the Dharma. I believe in Bhante's vision very, very deeply, and I was the right person to do that, or probably the only person at that time to be in that position. So I said yes to it, and I did it. Now that took effort. Now, as a result, I grew. I definitely grew. And I definitely didn't want to. I definitely didn't want to do that job. And I definitely benefited from it. So I grew. So I could see that in terms of the development myth. Do you see what I mean? Now, all that time that I was chair, my inner life, my meditative life, I'm more inclined to, in my meditation, think in terms of devotion and opening up to the Buddhas. So I would do my sadhana, the Manjughosha sadhana, or I was doing the Vajrasattva practice, or whatever practice I was doing. Inwardly, the dynamic was, please come through me. I want to open myself up to whatever it is. And I still do that. It's a sort of religious attitude. You could even say it's like prayer. And I still kind of do that. If I'm about to give a talk like tonight, You know, I confess I wasn't actually doing all 6 stages of the Metta Bhavana. What I was doing was my own thing, which was opening up and praying to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to help me to articulate what I want to articulate. Does that make sense? So there you go. So I've got at least two of those myths actively working in my life in different situations. And then, yes, probably the other two as well. Maybe I'll come on to those. So each of us may have more than one myth at play. Temperamentally, we might favor one of them. And at different stages of our Dharma life, that might change. Now, the fact that we're a Sangha of diverse people, a growing Sangha, and Bhante's vision has been that we grow individually in our own ways, means that different people will be in our Sangha responding to different myths at different times, in different ways. And I think this model helps us understand each other, because sometimes we've got into, particularly in the order, rather conflicted and polarized discussion, even debate and even argument about what the right way of practicing is, what practices work, what practices don't work. And sometimes that debate has been helpful, but a lot of the time, and I've sometimes been part of this, a lot of the time it's not been very helpful, it's not been very pleasant, it hasn't been very empathic, hasn't been very understanding. And somehow what we've been doing is, I think, arguing from the point of view where somebody has, say, the growth myth in mind, and they are talking to somebody who has the discovery myth in mind. And the person with the growth myth, the development myth, argues from the best bits of their myth and addresses the worst bits of the discovery myth. And the discovery myth person has the best bits of their myth and has a straw man for the development myth. And do you see what I mean? And then we just get into polarized debate, which actually there are pros and cons to each way of thinking about the Dharma life. That's what I'm trying to do. Yeah, that's what. Okay, so that's all a bit of background. And what I'd like us to do is look at this development myth, because it is such a foundational myth, not just for Bhante and Triratna, but for the Buddha. It is the classic way of talking about what we're doing in our Dharma lives. But it's not the only way. Although, interestingly, I think when Subhuti talked to Bhante about, I think Bhante was really pleased when Subhuti gave this talk on the 3 myths. He was very, very pleased. I think that's right. But I think later on, Bhante did say, look, there's only one myth. Bhante could be like that, contradictory and even contrary at times. There's only one myth. It's the development myth. That is the only myth. Yeah. And so I've, in thinking about this material, tried to bear that in mind somewhere. And the way that I bear that in mind, the way that I make sense of what Bhante meant by that, is that if you take the development myth in its best and broadest way, it could be the only myth that you need. But you do have to take it very, very broadly, very, very intelligently. So let's look at this development myth, because it is so foundational. And then tomorrow and the subsequent day, I'll see if we can look at the others. So what I'd like us to do together, rather than me just tell you, I'd like us to think together about what are the front and backs, what are the advantages and disadvantages, the pros and cons, what works about this myth and what can be a pitfall, what doesn't work about this myth. So I'd like us to think about that together. So I'd like us to start off with the positive, like what is good about this way of conceiving of the Dharma life, that we're on a path growing towards Buddhahood. What works about that? And what are the implications? But anyway, I'll just sort of open it up and see if Shubhanaga's got something to say.
Taking responsibility.
Yeah. Can you say taking responsibility for what?
For one's own life.
Right, for one's own. I think that's so good. Taking responsibility for one's own life and one's own practice and one's own mind. It's such a key principle in Buddhism that we are responsible for our own mind and our own mental states. We're not necessarily responsible for everything that happens to us in our lives because we're not in control in that way, but we are ultimately responsible for how we respond in our minds and through our actions for every situation. And that's such a key teaching. And after I've got, probably about 30 years of practice, I'm still learning that. I'm still learning that teaching. I mean, I'm learning how to apply it. I've probably talked about it, dozens of times and told other people to take responsibility for their own minds. I'm still learning to apply. I'm going to tell you the story that I was telling Arthur City. It's a bit of a side story, but anyway, I hope it illustrates something. So I've just come off solitary retreat recently. I was at Vajrasana on solitary retreat, and I'm out for a walk, and suddenly I hadn't had lunch, and I come over very hungry. I've got a weird kind of digestive thing, so I can be very full and then suddenly really hungry, and also my blood sugar can drop. So I was sort of very hungry suddenly, and slightly woozy with my blood sugar dropping. And I was still probably about half an hour to 40 minutes away from my hut on this walk. And I started having thoughts and images of food. Croissant came to mind. And, I didn't have any croissant in the hut, but they were what came to mind. And other things that I was going to eat and wanted to eat as soon as I could. It was all this, and inside my stomach, in my belly, there was this kind of slightly, uncomfortable kind of pangs, uncomfortable tightening and sort of, not exactly sort of cramps, but not pleasant kind of tightening feelings. And there was a certain sense of anxiety that, oh goodness, I'm really hungry, I'm feeling a bit woozy, and I'm half an hour, 40 minutes away from whatever, from being able to eat. So there was a tightening, emotionally and physically. Anyway, I caught myself after a couple of minutes and thought, right, now this is an opportunity, and let's look at what is actually happening. So as I'm walking, I decide to look at these thoughts of food that are in my mind and just see them for what they are. And actually all they were some images and some words. And as soon as I looked at them, they dissolve. If you look at a thought, it dissolves. It sort of pops like a bubble or bursts or dissolves. So these thoughts were mind-made, and they didn't have any reality, substantial reality to them. They're mind-made, they dissolved. I was still left with sensations in the stomach that were unpleasant. But now I didn't have any sort of graspy, cravey thoughts. As I started to do this, I also the anxiety, the tightness just dissolved. So now I'm just left with some discomfort as I'm walking, and it's kind of fine. And in a way, I could leave it there, but I'll go on. So then next, what I decided to do, so I'm now sort of all right, and I decide to, I just thought of all the people in the world that are starving, that are really hungry, and aren't just half an hour away from eating their next meal. So I just brought to mind that there are millions probably of people who are starving right now, and they deal with this sort of pain multiplied many times, many times, and they live with that. And then I started to, I actually brought Manjudosha to mind, my Yidan. I started to inwardly chant his mantra, and started to do something like the bodhicitta practice of trying to imaginatively see if I could breathe in the suffering and have Manjughosha transform it into love, into radiant light for all the people that were starving. It was an imaginative exercise. It was still mind-made. It was still mind-made, yeah? But they were mind-made thoughts, and now, well, yes, some image of Manjughosha that was very, very different from the graspy, cravey, I must have kind of thoughts. My heart opened. I felt this love, yeah, I felt love. I felt connected with life. I felt very grateful. I felt grateful, first of all, that I have the life that I have. I felt grateful that, you know, well, A, that I'm not starving. I'm so fortunate. I'm not one of the hungry. Hunger is the worst disease, says the Dhammapada, the Buddha says. And then I felt grateful that I've got these teachings where I can start to at least work on my mind. So there was gratitude, there was open-heartedness, there was sense of connection. There was still this discomfort in the belly, which was now really very minor and not really relevant. It was held within a much more positive context. And the world looked beautiful. I mean, it was a sunny day and I was walking in a beautiful place, and suddenly there was just beauty and love and connection and gratitude. And you see, that was a choice, and it's all mind-made. So what then I was reflecting on is that I create my world out of, yeah, I'm not in control of the physiological stuff that was going on, but I can respond out of craving and anxiety, or I can respond in a very different way. And each of us can do that because we've all got a mind. We have that choice every time. I don't always catch myself, unfortunately, but we have that choice. So that just comes, and that's part of this myth of responsibility, of development, that we have responsibility. Yeah, really, really key. Anyway, so that was a long aside, but Shubhanada, you're very right about that point. So any other pros, advantages of this myth? Yes, tell me your name. Gila. Yeah. Clarity and purpose. Can you say more about clarity? Clarity about what? Yes. Yes, exactly. So how else are we going to make choices unless we've got some sort of aim that we're orientating by? So it gives you that sort of clarity. That's really good. And purpose, which is related. I think having a purpose and an aim that we're trying to move towards is so important for a sense of agency and meaning in our lives. Yeah, really good. Thank you. Anybody else? Any other advantages? There's lots. Yeah, Jeremy.
There's things we can do. It's very clear that things that I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. 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 Now it's practices and it's pragmatic. In every situation, there's something that we can do. That we have not just responsibility, but we have agency, and that is so important. And it's particularly, I think, particularly needed at the start of one's Dharma life. And by start, I might mean 10, 15 years. It's so important to have practices that we can learn, that we can apply in our everyday lives, that we can actually do. So that, you know how religion can just become, oh no, I must believe something that somebody has told me, but it's difficult to know exactly what that means for my everyday life. Well, no, Buddhism's saying, no, this is practical. You do the mindfulness of breathing, you do the metta-bhavana, they really will change your response in everyday life to situations. They will help you be more considered, creative, empathic, etc., fulfilled. So it gives you actual tools, actual practices like ethics, for example. It says, look, you practice these precepts and you will find you have better relationships with yourself and with others. And it will lead to overall a greater sense of living a worthwhile and fulfilled life. Yeah, so practices, and it's practical, and there are things you can do. So key. And you don't have to have a great belief system. You don't even, when you start off with meditation and the precepts, say, you don't have to believe that the Buddha experienced enlightenment, that enlightenment is real and true. You can actually practice these practices without some huge metaphysical structure or belief system, and they'll still work. Guess what? They'll still work. And if you keep practicing, your faith, I think, well, this is certainly my experience, Shraddha will grow that the Buddha was teaching the truth. Yeah. And you will start to experience for yourself changes and maybe intimations of something of the Buddha's enlightenment. And then when you do, you'll know for yourself that, oh, yes, it's true. It's possible. So practice, it's really good, yeah. Yes, tell me your name. I don't know your name. Sarah, hi. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Everyone is on the path, can be on the path. That's really good because the path comes to us. Actually, what Bhante is clear about is that we are the path. It's not like the path is outside of us necessarily. It's more like we are the plant growing. Not we don't remain the same as we tread the path. We grow, we change. But that sort of, the implication is that all of us are on the path. There's no one that can't practice and change and grow. And Buddhism doesn't condemn anybody. It doesn't condemn anybody. I'm one of the things I feel sad about sometimes is our current culture in the West, in maybe it's worth more than the West. Anyway, our current culture, particularly exacerbated by social media, is so easy to blame. It's a culture of condemnation, very, very easy to say you are beyond the pale because of what you do or have done or something. Buddhism doesn't do that. It says, yeah, sure, we're not perfect. We do make mistakes and we have to take responsibility for that. It doesn't let us off the hook either. But on the other hand, it's saying you, whatever you are like, can grow and wherever you are. And nobody is incapable, completely incapable of moving towards enlightenment and indeed reaching enlightenment. So that's really quite something. It's inclusive in that way. Yeah, Sarah. Yes.
Front end, was it everything to the occasion glimpse of more than just front end?
Yeah. 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 Well, if any of these myths are going to work, they will lead to a glimpse of transcendence, of enlightenment, of something beyond all words, a realization of truth, of a glimpse of vision, perfect vision. Maybe we've even had those and we've started with those, because many people have vision experiences that then lead them to practice Buddhism. So yes, these myths will, if you practice Buddhism and you're doing it in an intelligent way, not in a sort of one-sided way that we might come on to, then they will lead to glimpses of vision. The actual glimpse of vision will probably be beyond any framework. In the moment of vision, it's not like there are words or myths or models that you can put that into. It's beyond me and you, subject and object, inside and outside. Even it's said to be beyond time and space. Depends how deep that vision is or how lofty it is, but it is said to be beyond all ways of conceiving. On the other hand, what happens typically is that we have those glimpses of vision, and then they go, they fade. We come back to our more ordinary experience. And then we will interpret that vision according to the myths that we have. We will interpret one way or the other those myths, and we'll work out, you know, so if this myth of development is the myth that is primary for somebody, and they have a glimpse of vision, then when that vision sort of dissolves or fades and they come back, what it will have done, hopefully at least, is strengthen their shraddha in the goal and in the path, and strengthen their commitment to that path. It may have shifted some perspective, and it might be that other myths have opened up as well. But they'll interpret it in those developmental terms. So the vision, I'm trying to say, is beyond the myths, and any of the myths can lead to it. Yeah. And then when the vision fades, we'll interpret that vision in our lives according to the views that we have. So, for example, if you were a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu, you know, a theistic practitioner, and you had a perfect vision experience, chances are you would interpret that when the vision faded, you would interpret that in terms of God. You would interpret that in terms of being touched by God, the grace of God, the grace of the divine, because that's the framework that you have. Does that make sense? So the frameworks will be really key for how we interpret the vision. And then how we interpret the vision is really key for then what we do with the vision. Yeah. So if you're in a theistic tradition, and you believe that you've been blessed by God, then presumably you'll pray more and surrender more to the grace of God. God might even speak to you and tell you what to do with your life, and you might open up to that, and that might be benign. But sometimes God seems to have spoken to people and told them to do the most horrendous, heinous things to those that don't believe. Yeah, and you look at when theistic religions go wrong, i.e., when they become literalized and you get religious fundamentalism. This is the back end of the surrender myth, by the way. Then that can really lead to huge cruelty. But the development myth, let's come back to the development myth, and let's look at, we've got a little bit of time, let's look at what are some of the disadvantages of the development myth, or the back end of it. Can anybody think of what? Yes.
Yeah.
Priyadatta.
There's something about I'm going to go from here to there,
Mm.
and I'll be there, and I'll get whatever it is I'm going to get. Yeah.
And what's wrong with that? Because you're right. Sorry?
I'm still there.
You're still there.
Me.
The same me. That's right.
The end of the race.
That's right. So a kind of literalizing of the path is that, yeah, Enlightenment is something that I will get if I do all the right things, practice the Metabhavana and mindfulness breathing every day, or do my sadhana every day. I will get enlightenment, and somehow enlightenment will be then added on to me. It'll still be me, and now I'll be enlightened. And so it'll be like a really shiny version of me, and people will love me finally. Maybe that's just my interpretation. You weren't saying that. People will finally adore me, and I'll be able to dispense wisdom and compassion to the world, because I'll have added on enlightenment. Do you see the literalizing of that? And when I put it like that, it sounds silly, but it's actually quite a subtle and almost insidious trap to fall into, and very, very easy to fall into. Hard to really conceive of ourselves as changing, isn't it? It's hard to even think of ourselves in 5 years' time. Do you know what I mean? And yet, yeah. So it's hard to think of ourselves as really changing to the point where we're enlightened. So it's very insidious, this trap. Yes.
Been serious about reducing suffering and others.
Yeah.
Just try to make it fit.
Yes.
You know, we sort of say, oh, no, that's me doing this or this.
Yes.
This, but actually, rather than it being about striving and receiving.
Yeah.
So I'm just receiving, we're actually actively, you know, there's something going on which is very much kind of more than two ways.
Yeah.
It's very rare where we're just striving.
Yeah. Yes. 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 Ticking Buddhist boxes, that's right. Not really internally changing. You know, I don't know if you've done this, but you can, if we're meditating together, you can sort of be drifting off, but you look good and you're worried about your posture. Not because you're trying to get more, but how do I look to others? And then it's sort of competitive meditation. Have you ever had that? You get that on retreat. Somebody wants to sit there longest and be the one that, you know, blows out the candles, stuffs out the candles. Not because they're that absorbed, but because, anyway, you can tick all the Buddhist boxes. I'm now revealing too much about my own flaws, probably. You can tick all the right boxes. You can even want to fix other people in a Buddhist way, make them the beneficiaries of your metta in a way that they don't necessarily need or want. So we can do all of that in a rather literal-minded, I am doing this kind of way that isn't very intelligent or open or receptive, very sort of strong-willed. And in a way, what that does, and it also links to what you were saying, Kridaka, it actually can strengthen egotism. Yeah. So now I've got a chaser. Do you know what I mean? It can just strengthen egotism, this myth, if it's working well for you. But the flip side also is that if it's not working well, I mean, say that you've been meditating for years, trying to do the mindfulness of breathing, Metabhavana, and you just feel, oh, I can never do this. Or you look at the precepts and you think, you know, I can't practice any of these precepts. Not really. What can easily happen with this myth is that then you become disheartened and despondent. So on the one hand, you can be really striving, and then you can feel, I'm never going to do it. They can go hand in hand, this sort of, I'm great, I'm going to do it, and oh, I'm rubbish, actually I can't. Do you recognize that? Like this threefold path of Sila, Samadhi, Prajna. I've known people who think, actually, look, you know, my ethics just isn't good enough. And you know, I'm doing all this stuff, but I'm not actually able to, you know, I'm still full of greed, actually, or hatred. And no wonder I can't get into dhyana. And the Buddha said, look, if you really want to get into dhyana, look at your ethics. So then you think, oh, you know, it's pretty rubbish, isn't it? And I can never get into dhyana. And Bhante says dhyana is really good and in fact needed for insight to arise, for wisdom to arise, you'll need some experience of it. So wisdom, frankly, you know, that's not for me. This lifetime, forget it. So all I'm going to do is what? I don't know. It just becomes a very we can set ourselves up to succeed in some way, then feel that we've failed, and then we become very disheartened and despondent. So that's the back end of this myth. Yeah, it's not. It's each myth. The way that we've been exploring and the way Subhuti explores it has metaphysical consequences about what you think you believe. It has psychological consequences like strengthening egotism or feeling rubbish or whatever. Or on the positive, like you feel agency. I can take charge of my life and do something. That's a psychological consequence, a positive one. It can have social consequences. So in this myth, what's emphasized is the need for good conditions. The need for good conditions. So we will seek out good conditions like retreats and collective practice and maybe community living and friendship, kalyana mitrata. We'll put ourselves in good conditions. So that's part of the growth path. Yeah. So that's a real positive, that it has that going for it. It emphasizes karma and the consequences of our actions. So that's really helpful because karma is part of the fabric of things. So they're sort of social consequences, the way that we practice, and moral consequences like karma. They're consequences. So, and then there's sort of methodological consequences. So we will value, with this myth, we'll value meditation practices or any other practices that are developmental. So mindfulness of breathing and metta bhavana help us develop more awareness and loving kindness, and they're orientated towards this myth. So we'll value those practices. Yeah. So you can see that it'll color our whole Dharma lives, but yes, there are some pitfalls to this myth. Egotism, despondency are two of them. It can also be like related to despondency. As you practice this myth for longer and longer, you can start to think, well, enlightenment's just impossible. I'll never get there. It's related to kind of despondency. There's one more sort of that I want to point out, which if we had time, we could just explore more, which is that if you lose heart or faith in a transcendental goal, or if you never had faith in a transcendental goal, like a goal that transcends subject and object and time and space, if you lose faith that consciousness is capable of an experience that transcends our normal 5 physical senses and our normal ordinary mind, that there's some other way of experiencing and being that is completely beyond all of that. If you lose faith in that, then this myth becomes self-development in a narrow sort of health and well-being sense. Yeah. So I can become, kinder. Great. I can become more mindful. Great. I mean, that's not bad, but it's not going to be enlightenment. Lots of people are kind and mindful in the world, more so than I am. You know, many who aren't striving for enlightenment. And then I think what can happen is that we think that this life is all there is. You know, it's based in kind of materialism. There isn't some scientific materialism, that is. There isn't some other transcendent goal. This life, this body, is all there is. And so what I've got to do is try and live my best life, be my best self. And Buddhism gives you some tools to do that. That's sort of all right, but grossly shrinks the Buddhist vision down to a health and well-being one. And then what we do is we think, oh, I want to help other people also live their best lives. You know, because kindness is part of that and compassion is part of that. Da, da, da. But then the goal becomes more about trying to fix this life and this world. And this world is full of problems. The climate's going haywire. We're polluting the planet. There are wars breaking out still now in Europe. There's injustice, social injustice in this country and elsewhere. There's, as I said, millions of people starving. All sorts of horrible things are happening in this world right now. And what can happen is we can think that being Buddhist, our main purpose is to help solve those problems in whatever way we can. Why that's a mistake is not because we shouldn't be helping the world, but it's a mistake if we've lost a transcendent ideal. Does that make sense? It becomes like, let's just fix this life and this world. Subhuti calls it adjustment therapy. And Buddhism becomes just about, let's make samsara a better place. Whereas the Buddha was saying, no, samsara never works. There is something beyond samsara. And you try and, when you realize that and you embody that and you experience that, then sure, you come back with wisdom and you help in the world. So this is where, for example, activism can go wrong if it becomes an end in itself. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think there's all sorts of things that can be distorted if we lose a sense and a possibility of transcendence, of enlightenment as a transcendent goal. Then this myth becomes the myth of self-development in a narrower sense of health and well-being. And Buddhism is increasingly prey to that in the West. Increasingly, I think people are seeing it as a sort of psychological tool of adjustment therapy, with the underlying scientific materialist view still intact, that this life is all there is, this body is all there is, there's nothing more. Anyway, I'll leave you on that. I've gone over time. There's more probably to explore about the front and back of this myth, but I also want to sort of move on. And as we explore the other myths, what you'll see is that they complement each other. So the back end of this development myth will be compensated for, if that's the right word, by the front of the surrender myth. You see how the surrender myth will answer some of the issues of the development myth, and you see how you need them both. And then you see how the discovery myth can also add something, and the emergence myth can add something. And you see how everything, well, actually, we need to be alive to different myths and models at the same time. So come back tomorrow, because otherwise you won't realize that. So tomorrow is surrender. I hope to see you then. Thank you.